In this module, we're going to talk about address books, and that includes the offline address books, address book policies, and the hierarchical address book. To start with, let's look at offline address books. Offline address books, or OABs, basically provide a copy of a collection of address lists, that's address lists and global address lists, that can be downloaded by an Outlook client. That way, the users can access the address book while they are disconnected from the network. And it also means that cached mode Outlook clients, which always use the OAB by default, can access the address book faster than if they were making live queries to the online GAL. The offline address book generation has changed somewhat over the years with different versions of Exchange. Prior to Exchange 2013, the OAB generation was performed by a mailbox server. The server would generate an OAB and store it as a series of files on that server, and then they would be distributed to other servers in the network as well, and clients would download those files from one of those servers. However, if the server failed, offline address book updates would not occur, and you would have issues with clients looking at stale data that did not reflect the latest global address list. In Exchange 2013 and 2016, the OAB generation was moved to a special mailbox rather than to a server. The mailbox is an arbitration mailbox with what is known as the OAB gen capability set to true. And when you host that mailbox in a database availability group, then you get high availability for it, and it's no longer susceptible to that single server failure, taking the OAB generation function offline. Whichever mailbox server is hosting the active database that the OAB gen mailbox is hosted in will perform the OAB generation task. Updates to the offline address book are generated by the server roughly every 8 hours. The administrator can force an update by running the update offline address book commandlet if they need to. Outlook clients will download the offline address book approximately every 24 hours. The user can force an update if they want to through their Outlook send receive settings. And what all of that basically means is you can expect anywhere from 24 to 48 hours for changes that are made in Active Directory, so changes such as the department or the surname of a mail recipient, to be reflected in Outlook's copy of the OAB, because after the change is made, even though the global address list is updated almost immediately, the offline address book is generated perhaps up to 8 hours later and may only be downloaded by the client 24 hours later, and with a few delays and other factors in between, that's where that 24 to 48 hours estimate comes from. It's possible to have multiple OAB generation mailboxes. You can have multiple offline address books. You may want to have offline address books that contain different sets of address lists for different parts of the company, or you can just have different offline address books that contain the same address lists. You can use one OAB generation mailbox to generate all of the offline address books if you want to, or you can have multiple OAB generation mailbox so that you can optimize that OAB generation for different geographic locations. Each offline address book is generated by a single OAB generation mailbox. So that is a one-to-one relationship between an OAB and the OAB generation mailbox responsible for it. You don't have multiple OAB generation mailboxes responsible for the same OAB. However, you can have multiple offline address books generated by the same offline address book generation mailbox. There are some geographic issues that you may need to consider depending on the environment. Now, in a very simple environment, these types of issues may not actually come up at all. But in larger, more complex environments, perhaps where there is a bound namespace model or a regional namespace model being used, that's when some additional work by the administrator might be required to optimize the OAB experience. As an example, let's say that we have a user in San Francisco and they're connecting to San Francisco Exchange servers and downloading their offline address book from the OAB gen mailbox that is hosted in San Francisco. So that process is fine. Everything's reasonably optimized in terms of geography there. When you have a New York user, they may be connecting to New York Exchange servers, but to download the OAB, their connection is being proxied across to San Francisco. So that is potentially not optimal depending on how far apart the two sites are and what sort of bandwidth is available between them. So in a scenario like that, the administrator might choose to create a New York offline address book generation mailbox. And to do that, they'd run the new mailbox commandlet with the arbitration switch, give the mailbox a name such as OAB Gen NY, place it on a database that is primarily hosted in the New York data center, and then just give it a meaningful display name so that other administrators know what it's for. The set mailbox commandlet is then used to set the OAB Gen attribute to true. Once that New York-based offline address book generation mailbox has been created, a new offline address book for New York users can be created. In this case, it's just going to include the default global address list, the same as the San Francisco-based offline address book. But in this case, the generating mailbox is the newly created OAB Gen NY mailbox located in New York. The New York users then need to be assigned to that New York offline address book. You can do that at the database level by running the set mailbox database commandlet, or you can do it at the mailbox level by running the set mailbox commandlet. So now we have a more optimal experience in terms of offline address book downloads. San Francisco users will generally be connecting to the San Francisco offline address book mailbox to download the files, and New York users have their own offline address book generation mailbox where they can retrieve their own offline address book files. But then the New York user does some traveling, maybe spends a week working out of the San Francisco office. In this situation, they might connect to San Francisco Exchange servers, but because they've been configured to use the New York offline address book, their connection is having to be proxied back across the WAN to New York to retrieve those offline address book files. So now we have the problem again of a less than optimal client experience. The solution in Exchange 2016 is to enable what's called global web distribution. All of the address books in the organization can be configured by running the set offline address book commandlet, set the virtual directories to null, so there are no longer specifically allocated OAB virtual directories for distribution of those OABs, and set the global web distribution enabled attribute to true. The effect of that change is instead of the New York user having to be proxied all the way back to New York across the WAN to access the offline address book files, their connection will be proxied to the San Francisco offline address book instead. And because global web distribution is enabled, that OAB generation mailbox is able to participate in distribution of the offline address book files for New York, even though it doesn't participate in generation of those files. The way it works is the first time it gets a request for an offline address book that it's not responsible for, it will reach out across the network to the New York OAB Gen mailbox, download the files, and the next time the client makes the request, they'll be available locally in San Francisco, which is a much more optimal experience of having the OAB Gen mailbox fetch the files once and then serve them up to multiple clients, rather than have multiple clients connecting across the WAN and downloading the files individually. Now let's discuss address book policies, or ABPs. The goal of address book policies is global address list segmentation. ABPs provide a customized view of the global address list. They optimize the GAL by limiting visibility of other recipients in the organization. It only limits visibility. It does not prevent the users from actually emailing each other. If your organization has a requirement for legal separation or some type of ethical wall, for example, separating a research and development department from a sales department, for that purpose, you should use mail flow rules or transport rules. Complementing address book policies is the address book policy routing agent that can be installed on the Exchange servers, which prevents users in different virtual organizations. A virtual organization is basically a segment of the GAL. It prevents those users from using Outlook to view each other's information. And by that I mean they can't type in the email address of someone and see more detail about that person than they would otherwise be able to see for an external recipient. The types of scenarios where address book policies are useful are hosting providers. So these are hosting companies who have multiple customers hosted within the same Exchange organization, and they can use address book policies to separate them into virtual organizations. It's also useful when there are separate businesses operating under the same organization that perhaps need some type of separation from each other. And a good example is when mergers and divestitures are occurring. You can use address book policies to separate the organizations before any actual migration to a completely different forest and exchange organization has actually occurred. And another common usage of address book policies is schools and educational institutions to prevent students and teachers from seeing other students and teachers that they're not directly responsible for or directly being taught by. Let's look at an example for Globomantics. Globomantics has decided to divest the widget division. It's no longer part of their core business and they're going to try and sell it off. As part of that process, they've decided to use address book policies to break up the two organizations into separate virtual organizations, while all the business stuff that is involved in separating the two companies goes on in the background. To make that possible, we're going to need to construct address book policies. We'll need one for Globomantics, and an address book policy is made up of address lists, a room address list, a global address list, and an offline address book. So for the Globomantics company that will remain, they'll need address lists, and we'll just follow a naming convention of AL for address list and Globo for the company, one for the users and the distribution groups, and then one for the contacts. Another address list is created to host all the room mailboxes. If there are no room mailboxes in the organization, you still need to create that address list, but it can be empty. A global address list is created for Globomantics, and then an offline address book that contains that GAL and maybe those address lists as well is also created. For the widget division that is being divested, the same set of address lists, room address list, global address list, and offline address book are also created. The CEO needs visibility of both organizations. So the CEO's address book policy is going to include the address list for Globomantics and the address lists for the widget division. And then the CEO can just continue to use some of the other default address lists and global address lists and offline address book that already exist in the organization. The question is then, how do you separate the recipients? The recommended practice is to use one of the custom attributes available in Active Directory for those mail recipients. There are custom attribute 1 to custom attribute 15 that you can choose from. And the reason for using custom attributes as opposed to one of the other Active Directory attributes, such as the department or company attribute, is that the custom attributes are exposed to all of the set commandlets. So all recipient types can be managed and configured for address book policies. If you were to try and base all the address book policies off another attribute, such as company, you would find that the commandlets do not always support filtering by that attribute. So there's some setup involved. We need to create the Globomantics user and distribution groups address list. That will be the new address list commandlet. Give the address list a name, and then the recipient filter is just the same as a normal recipient filter for an address list of this type. But the custom attribute 15 criteria is also included so that only recipients with custom attribute 15 set to Globomantics will be included in this address list. Another address list is created for contacts, and again, the recipient type of mail contact is used, which is normal for a contacts address list, and then we need to include that criteria in the filter for custom attribute 15 equaling Globomantics. One room address list is required, so it's a case of running new address list again with a different recipient filter that includes room mailboxes and again includes filtering based on custom attribute 15 equaling Globomantics. New global address list is used to create the custom GAL for Globomantics. All you need to do is filter that one on custom attribute 15 and then finally create a new offline address book for Globomantics that includes the Globomantics GAL. And you can include other address lists for Globomantics in that offline address book as well, but it's quite normal to only include the GAL in an offline address book just to keep the size down. Well, now that we have all of those address lists and global address lists and offline address book created for Globomantics, we can use the new address book policy commandlet to create the address book policy that includes all of those address lists. And you can see the parameters for including address lists, the room list, the global address list, and the offline address book. We'd need to repeat those steps for the widget division, running the same commandlets and filtering based on custom attribute 15, looking for widget division instead of Globomantics. And just to recap so it's clear, the Globomantics address book policy only includes the Globomantic lists and offline address book. The widget division address book policy only includes the widget division lists and offline address book. And then the CEO's address book policy includes all of the address lists and the default GAL and default offline address book. Once those address book policies have been created, you can assign them to mailboxes. To assign the address book policy for Globomantics to all of the Globomantics mailboxes, you could run get mailbox and return an unlimited result size, and then filter those results on custom attribute 15, looking for custom attribute 15 equals Globomantics, pipe that into set mailbox and set the address book policy to abp-globo, which is the name of the address book policy created for Globomantics. And once you have all those address lists and address book policies in place, things get a little bit easier from that point on. You've done all the hard work in creating all those objects up front, and you've created the policies. And from there on in, it's just a matter of ensuring that your mailbox provisioning processes account for that custom attribute 1 to 15 that is used for the address book policy filtering. So your provisioning process needs to assign the correct address book policy to each new mailbox at the time they're created. Let's talk about the hierarchical address book. In an Exchange server organization, the address book that users see in Outlook is basically just a flat alphabetical list of names. And there's no easy way to look at the address book and work out the structure of the organization or to tell who the most senior people are within a group. And for some companies, being able to identify the organizational structure or know who reports to who and who's in charge of a particular group is quite important, and they want to be able to use the GAL for that purpose. So let's say we have a company such as Globomantics, and the company looks like this. The organizational structure involves an executive group and several top-level departments such as sales and marketing, corporate services, operations, and within those departments there might be separate teams. For example, in corporate services you've got finance, human resources, facilities, and administration. The hierarchical address book uses distribution group nesting and then also a seniority index to display an address book that aligns with that organization's structure. One important note to keep in mind is that the hierarchical address book and address book policies can't be used in the same organization. You have to choose one or the other. So let's go into Globomantics and configure the hierarchical address book. The hierarchical address book is made up of a series of distribution groups that are nested in a way that matches the organizational structure. Those distribution groups can be located anywhere you like in Active Directory. You can use existing groups or you can create new groups, but it's useful to place them into a dedicated organizational unit so that there's no confusion about their actual purpose. So to start with, let's just create a new hierarchical address book OU for Globomantics. Next, we need to create the distribution group that will be used as the root of the hierarchical address book. That group is then configured to be a hierarchical group. Once you've got that group created and it has been configured as a hierarchical group, you can set the organization config to enable the hierarchical address book. And this involves just specifying the group that will be used as the root of the hierarchy. Now, many of the changes that are made while setting up the hierarchical address book take a little while before the users will begin to see them. There is some Active Directory replication, regeneration of the offline address book, and so on. So let's continue with the rest of the configuration now, and then we should see all of the results in one go right at the end. Even for a simple organizational structure like Globomantics, there's a few groups to be created and the group nesting needs to be configured. And we also need to add some users into the group. So to speed things along, let's use some PowerShell. To begin with, we can just define the names of the groups into an array and then loop through each member of the array, running the new distribution group commandlet to create each of those groups in turn. Following on from that, the add distribution group member commandlet is used to nest the groups into each other. And then finally, some users are added to the ICT group so that we can demonstrate how the seniority works within groups as well. So we should be able to just paste all of that into the Exchange management shell, and all of those groups will be created, group membership will be added, and jumping back into Active Directory users and computers, there we can see all those distribution groups. So starting with the root of the hierarchical address book, we can see that there are groups that are now nested in that root group. There's some more nesting in the operations group as well with 2 subgroups. And then in ICT, we see the actual ICT group members. Now, all of those newly created groups also need to be configured to be hierarchical groups. So we can just run get group and retrieve all of the groups in the hierarchical address book OU. We're only interested in the groups in this case that are not already hierarchical groups, and then pipe that to the set group commandlet, setting the is hierarchical group flag to true on all of those additional groups as well. Well, after a few hours, let's check back with one of the Outlook clients and see what the effect has been of implementing that hierarchical address book for Globomantics. The address book in Outlook now has 2 tabs, the name list, which is the regular alphabetical name list, and now also this organization view. And as you can see, the hierarchy root group of Globomantics is located at the top of the tree, and then the other hierarchical groups are included as well, and they follow the same nesting that was used in Active Directory. But there is something not quite right about this. For one thing, the executive group really should be at the top of that list. It is one of the more important groups, and so having it displayed up the top of the tree is quite important. And then also within individual groups such as ICT, the names are still listed in alphabetical order, which doesn't put the team leader at the very top of the list. We can resolve both of those issues by using the seniority index for groups and for users. The seniority index is a number from 0 to 100, with 100 being the most senior. So there's plenty of room in that 0 to 100 range for you to set multiple priorities for different users or groups. In the case of Globomantics, the executive group wants to be at the top of the list, so giving them a seniority index of 100 will achieve that. At the same time, the sales and marketing group would like to be seen next on the list, and so a seniority index of 50 will put them above any of the remaining groups which have no seniority index set, so they will just continue to be listed in alphabetical order. By the same token, the ICT team leader would like to be seen at the top of the list in his group as well. So again, setting a seniority index of 100 will ensure that he appears at the top of that list when viewed in Outlook. Now, much the same as implementing the hierarchical address book in the first place, these changes will take a small amount of time to take effect and before they will appear in Outlook clients. So we'll check back on these shortly. So after a few hours, let's check back on that Outlook client and see if the hierarchical address book changes with those seniority indexes have taken effect. And it looks like they have. The executive group is now showing at the top of the organizational tree, followed by sales and marketing, and then the rest of the groups follow on from there. And within operations, if we go into ICT, we can now see that the ICT team leader is listed at the top of that department as well, where he belongs. Managing a hierarchical address book is an ongoing process. It's not, unfortunately, a simple one-time setup. Especially in larger organizations, if you have a high rate of change in the organizational structure as departments are moved around and reshuffled, or as people change roles, getting promoted or demoted or moving departments or leaving the company entirely, you'll need to keep making changes to things like the group nesting and the seniority index to have your hierarchical address book continue to accurately reflect the organizational structure. So to recap, this module was about address books, which included offline address books, address book policies, and hierarchical address books. In the next module, we're going to look at deploying the Office Online Server.